The debate stage in New York was heavy with heat, tension, and unspoken resentment. Three podiums stood like battle stations under blinding white lights. Andrew Cuomo, the seasoned politician trying to claw back his legacy. Curtis Sliwa, the fiery populist with his trademark red beret. And Zohran Mamdani, the youngest, calmest, and yet somehow the most dangerous man in the room. The air buzzed with expectation. Cameras locked in. Every spectator, every viewer could sense that something explosive was about to unfold. The moderator's voice broke the silence. Let's begin with a question about leadership and accountability. Cuomo smirked first. Leadership, he began, his voice dripping with practiced arrogance, is about experience, about knowing the system, not burning it down. His words hung like smoke in the air. Then Sliwa pounced. Experience, he barked. You mean corruption, backroom deals, and years of failed promises? New Yorkers are tired of your experience, Andrew. The audience gasped. It was the first real hit of the night. Cuomo straightened his tie, pretending not to flinch, but the vein on his temple said otherwise. And then quietly but firmly, Zohran spoke. Maybe leadership isn't about experience or outrage, he said, his voice low but commanding. Maybe it's about empathy. About knowing what it's like to take the subway that doesn't run, to breathe air that makes your children cough, to fight for rent you can barely afford. His words didn't roar, they resonated. The crowd shifted, drawn in by the calm power in his tone. Cuomo tried to interrupt. Spare us the poetry, Zohran. You've never run anything. But Mamdani didn't look at him. He looked straight into the camera. You ran this city, he said slowly, and people are still running away from it. The room froze. Even Sliwa looked stunned. The moderator tried to regain control, but the energy had changed. Suddenly, it wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. Cuomo's face darkened. You think politics is that simple? He hissed. You'll learn the hard way what power really is. Mamdani leaned forward, the faintest trace of a smile forming. Power isn't what you hold, he said. It's what you give. The audience erupted, not in applause, but in something deeper. A shared realization that this young man had just said what they had all been waiting to hear. The moderator, visibly shaken, tried to move to the next question, but Cuomo cut him off. You want to play idealist? Fine. Tell us how your fairy tale politics will fix a city drowning in debt. Mamdani didn't blink. By ending the greed that caused it, he shot back. By making sure no billionaire treats New York like a playground while millions live one paycheck away from the street. The camera zoomed in. His voice rose, not in anger but conviction. New York deserves better than recycled promises. It deserves justice, that line cut through the air like thunder. Cuomo and Sliwa both stared, visibly rattled. And for the first time, it was clear to everyone watching. This wasn't just a debate. It was the beginning of something far bigger. A movement, a challenge to everything New York's old power had built. As the lights dimmed slightly for the next round, Zohran's expression didn't change. Calm, focused, relentless. The crowd murmured his name softly, almost unconsciously. Zohran Mamdani, the outsider who had just taken command of the room. The tension only deepened as the debate moved forward. Cuomo's confidence began to crack beneath the weight of Mamdani's calm precision. Every word Zohran spoke seemed to land exactly where it hurt most. The moderator turned to the next topic, public safety. Sliwa straightened his jacket, ready to pounce. New York is falling apart, he declared. Crime is out of control. We need more police, not less. His words drew cheers from one side of the audience and murmurs from the other. Mamdani didn't rush to respond. He waited until the noise settled, then said, if safety means fear for black and brown kids in their own neighborhoods, then maybe we should redefine what safety really means. The silence that followed was heavy. Cuomo jumped in, his tone sharp. Typical idealism. You talk about redefining safety while people are afraid to walk home at night. It's fantasies. Mamdani turned toward him, his eyes steady. What's fantasy, he replied, is thinking the same broken system will suddenly start working for the people it was never built to protect. Cuomo tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. Sliwa crossed his arms, glaring. So what's your plan? He demanded. Hugs for criminals? Mamdani didn't flinch. No, he said. Hope for communities. Jobs instead of jails. Mental health care instead of handcuffs. The crowd began to stir again. Even through the cameras, you could feel the energy shifting toward him. Cuomo's patience snapped. You think slogans will save the city? He barked. You don't understand what governing means. Mamdani shot back instantly. And you don't understand what suffering means. You've forgotten the people you claim to lead. The moderator tried to calm them, but neither man was backing down. The studio felt electric. Every exchange was sharper, every line more personal. Cuomo leaned closer to the microphone, his voice dripping with bitterness. You think you can just walk in here and tell us how to fix this city? You're naive. Mamdani's response was quiet, but it hit harder than any shout could. Maybe it takes someone naive enough to still believe New York belongs to its people. The crowd erupted again. It wasn't the roar of political fans. It was something raw, almost emotional. People were standing up, clapping, not because of performance, but because of conviction. For the first time that night, Cuomo looked unsure. Sliwa tried to regain attention with a jest about socialist experiments, but even his voice was fading into the background. Mamdani had captured the moment completely. The moderator's next question, about housing, gave him another opening. New York has become unlivable for the very people who built it, Zohran began. Developers buy dreams and turn them into rent receipts. Families are forced out, history is erased, and no one in power does a thing. He paused, scanning the room. If we can afford luxury towers that stand empty, then we can afford homes for the people who clean them. Cameras zoomed closer. Cuomo clenched his jaw. Sliwa avoided eye contact. The moderator struggled to maintain neutrality, but failed. There was a tremor in his voice when he thanked Mamdani for his answer. The audience knew it too. This wasn't the standard rhetoric of a campaign. It was the sound of something real, something that cut through the noise. Zohran Mamdani wasn't performing. He was telling the story of a city that had forgotten itself and daring it to remember. The debate had started as a competition, but by now it felt like a turning point. Cuomo's anger wasn't about politics anymore. It was about fear. Fear that New York's old order was slipping away and a new voice was rising in its place. Mamdani stood tall, unmoved by the lights, the hostility, or the pressure. He was no longer just a candidate. He was becoming the embodiment of the city's restless heart. As the debate neared its final segment, the air in the studio grew heavier. Even through the camera lens, you could feel the tension between the past and the future, between power that had ruled for decades and a voice that refused to be silenced. Cuomo leaned back in his chair, his polished smile finally gone. You talk like you're the first one who's ever cared, he said, trying to sound calm but failing to hide the tremor in his tone. I've led this state through crises. I've made the tough calls. What have you done, Zohran, besides criticize? Mamdani's eyes didn't waver. He didn't raise his voice. You made tough calls for yourself, he said slowly, not for the people who paid the price for them. A low murmur spread through the audience again. Cuomo shifted uncomfortably, searching for a comeback, but Zohran continued, his words cutting like quiet thunder. You built towers of power and called it leadership. But leadership isn't about building walls. It's about breaking them down. The studio lights reflected off Cuomo's face, now pale under pressure. Sliwa saw his chance and tried to step in. You're all talk, Mamdani, he sneered. Let's be real. You want to turn New York into some socialist experiment. You think people want that? Mamdani turned to him with a faint smile. People don't want socialism or capitalism, he said. They just want dignity. And if your system can't give them that, then maybe the system is the problem. The crowd broke into applause. Even those who hadn't come to support him couldn't deny the strength of his conviction. Cameras panned across the faces of the audience, some nodding, some stunned, but all watching closely. Cuomo's frustration spilled over. You think passion equals experience? He snapped. Governing isn't about dreams, it's about discipline. Zohran tilted his head slightly. Discipline without compassion, he replied, is just control. The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the hum of the lights. The moderator, visibly tense, tried to wrap up the debate, but the energy in the room had already taken on a life of its own. It was no longer a discussion. It was a reckoning. Mamdani leaned forward, his voice low but firm. For years, this city has been run by people who see its residents as numbers, not as lives. You call it management. I call it neglect. We can't keep pretending everything's fine when the foundation is rotting. He looked directly into the camera now, not speaking to Cuomo or Sliwa anymore, but to every New Yorker watching from home. This city doesn't need saviors, he said. It needs servants. People who don't run from the problems, but stand with those who live through them. For a brief second, even Cuomo seemed to freeze. The applause came like a wave breaking through the walls of the studio. It wasn't choreographed, it was genuine, raw, unstoppable. Cuomo glanced at his team behind the cameras, but their faces told him what he already knew. The debate was over, and he had lost. Not in points or polls, but in spirit. Sliwa muttered something under his breath, but no one cared. The spotlight had shifted completely. As the moderator gave his closing remarks, Mamdani remained still, his gaze steady, his expression calm. He didn't need to declare victory. The silence of his opponents did that for him. When the lights dimmed and the cameras cut off, Cuomo stood slowly, his usual arrogance replaced by a weary disbelief. Mamdani turned to him, extended a hand and said simply, "It's not about winning tonight. It's about changing tomorrow." Cuomo hesitated, then shook his hand without a word. The moment was small but powerful, a quiet acknowledgement of something larger than politics. Outside the studio, the city lights flickered against the night sky. News outlets were already buzzing, clips of Mamdani's lines spreading like wildfire across social media. But he didn't stop to celebrate. As he stepped into the cold New York air, he whispered to one of his aides, "This is just the beginning." And somewhere, deep in the restless heart of the city, millions of people who had stopped believing began to feel a spark again. A spark that told them change wasn't just possible, it was already happening. By the next morning, New York was on fire, not in flames, but in conversation. Every news outlet, talk show, and podcast was replaying the debate, dissecting every word Zohran Mamdani had said. Clips of him standing calmly under the bright lights, confronting Cuomo and Sliwa, flooded social media feeds. "Discipline without compassion is just control," one line read across thousands of posts. Another clip of him saying, "People don't want socialism or capitalism, they just want dignity," became a viral anthem. It was more than a political moment. It was a cultural one. In the streets of Queens, delivery drivers, shop owners, and students were talking about him. In Manhattan boardrooms, executives whispered his name with unease. Even in Albany, political operatives were recalculating their strategies, sensing a shift they couldn't control. Inside a modest campaign office in Astoria, Zohran watched the news coverage in silence. His team was buzzing with excitement, phones ringing, reporters requesting interviews, donors reaching out. But Mamdani seemed distant, his gaze fixed on the window. "They'll come harder now," he said quietly. His aide frowned. "Who?" "Everyone who benefits from things staying the same." That afternoon, Cuomo's campaign released a statement accusing Mamdani of reckless populism and misleading rhetoric. But the damage was already done. The statement sounded defensive, tired, and disconnected from the energy pulsing through the city. Meanwhile, Sliwa went on a late-night show, trying to mock Mamdani's performance, but his sarcasm only made the crowd more sympathetic toward Zohran. The next day, a rally had been planned in Union Square. It was supposed to be a small gathering, but by evening, thousands had shown up. Workers, students, parents, even disillusioned voters who hadn't cared about politics in years. As Mamdani walked up to the microphone, chants of his name filled the square. He looked out over the crowd, faces of every background, united not by ideology, but by exhaustion from being ignored. He raised his hand for silence, and when the crowd quieted, his voice carried clearly across the cold air. "They say I'm unrealistic," he began. "They say what I'm asking for can't be done. But the only reason they say that is because they've never tried. Applause erupted, but he continued before it could drown him out. They tell us the system is broken, but it's not broken. It was built this way. Built to serve power, not people. Built to make us believe change is impossible. And if you believe that, then they have already won. Cameras from every network were pointed at him now, capturing his every word. But Mamdani wasn't performing. He was speaking like a man who finally had a city listening. When they raise rent, when they cut schools, when they fund police but not hospitals, they're not making mistakes. They're making choices. And every choice they make tells you who they serve. He paused, scanning the sea of faces. But tonight we make our own choice. To build a city that doesn't run on fear, but on hope. A city that belongs to everyone, not just those who can afford it. The crowd roared, and for a moment, it felt like New York itself was breathing again. Reporters scribbled frantically. News cameras zoomed in on his face. The image of Zohran Mamdani standing against the city skyline, speaking to thousands, became the defining visual of the campaign. Back in his office later that night, Mamdani sat alone, the noise of celebration faintly echoing from outside. He looked down at his notebook, scribbled pages of ideas, dreams, and promises he'd made to himself long before the cameras came. The weight of what was coming pressed on him, but so did something stronger. A quiet conviction that he was exactly where he needed to be. A campaign manager entered softly. "They're saying you've changed the race," she said with a smile. "No," Zohran replied without looking up. "We've changed the conversation." In the dim light of the office, the words hung in the air. He knew the fight was far from over. The powerful would regroup, the media would twist, and the backlash would come. But something irreversible had happened. The people had found their voice again, and this time they weren't giving it back. Days turned into weeks, and what had started as a single debate moment evolved into a movement that neither party machines nor media moguls could contain. The city's rhythm began to change. Posters with Mamdani's face appeared in subways and windows across boroughs. Not slick campaign ads, but handmade signs painted with words like, "Hope lives here," and "People over power." The establishment laughed at first, calling it a social media illusion, but it was becoming something they couldn't laugh off anymore. Polls shifted. Cuomo's lead shrank daily. Sliwa's numbers flatlined. And in every neighborhood, from the Bronx to Brooklyn, ordinary people who had never attended a political rally in their lives were knocking on doors, sharing clips, wearing buttons that read, "We're not waiting." One cold evening, inside a dimly lit studio, Mamdani was invited to a live television interview, his biggest yet. The host, known for her aggressive style, tried to corner him. "You've inspired a lot of emotion, Zohran," she said, "but emotion doesn't run a city. Do you really think idealism can beat decades of experience?" Mamdani smiled faintly. "Experience isn't the problem," he said. "It's what they've chosen to learn from it." The host leaned in. "And what have you learned?" He looked straight into the camera. "That when people are desperate enough, they'll believe anyone who offers them certainty. But what we need isn't certainty, it's courage. The courage to rebuild what others were too afraid to touch." For a second, the studio went silent. Even the host didn't know how to respond. The clip spread across social media within minutes. Headlines followed. Mamdani turns interview into manifesto. New York's rebel candidate speaks truth to power. That night, under the lights of Times Square, something extraordinary happened. Thousands gathered spontaneously, holding candles and chanting his name. Drone shots captured a river of people stretching for blocks, their voices echoing between skyscrapers. Some carried signs quoting his debate line, "They're not making mistakes, they're making choices." Others simply held up hearts. On a rooftop nearby, Mamdani watched quietly, surrounded by his small team. One of his aides whispered, "You've done it. You've won them over." He shook his head. "Winning them over isn't the point," he said softly. "The point is making them believe they deserve more." The next morning, newspapers called it the night New York changed. The mayoral race had officially become a referendum on the city's soul. The old guard was panicking, launching attack ads, digging for scandals, fabricating controversies. But every attempt backfired. The more they attacked, the more authentic Mamdani appeared. He refused to retaliate. Instead, he visited hospitals, schools, shelters, shaking hands and listening. Cameras followed, but he barely looked at them. He wasn't acting for an audience anymore. He was living what he preached. Election day arrived like a storm. Lines wrapped around city blocks. Reporters described the turnout as historic. As the results trickled in, the tension in the campaign office was unbearable. Every update brought cheers, gasps, or silence. Then, at midnight, the final numbers came in. The screen flashed. Zohran Mamdani, 51%. The room erupted. People screamed, hugged, cried. Cameras swarmed in. But Mamdani just stood still, staring at the screen. After a long moment, he whispered, "This wasn't supposed to be possible." His campaign manager smiled through tears. That's exactly why it had to be. Hours later, on a balcony overlooking the city, Mamdani finally addressed the crowd waiting below. His voice was calm but heavy with emotion. "This victory isn't mine," he said. "It belongs to every person who ever felt invisible. To everyone told that the system was too strong to change. Tonight, you proved them wrong." The crowd roared, but he raised his hand for quiet. "They'll tell you I'm a dreamer. Maybe I am, but dreams built this city. And it's time those dreams belong to the people again." The cheers became deafening. Fireworks burst over the skyline. For the first time in decades, New York didn't feel like a machine. It felt alive. As the lights of Times Square shimmered below, Zohran Mamdani stood there, not as a politician, but as something rarer. A symbol of what happens when truth, conviction, and courage finally break through the noise. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the city's reckoning.